delighted to have you here today.
Thank you.
Especially as Asia Society has recently opened an exhibition of Aboriginal bark paintings in our museum downstairs. Delighted to speak to you a little bit about your life, your career, and the struggle of Aboriginal people in Australia to have their voices heard.
Sure.
So I'd love to just get your big overview of how this relationship between the Australian government and Indigenous people in Australia has evolved. So in your eyes, can you tell us a little bit about the key turning points in those relations from when you were a child until today?
Well, one of the really seminal moments was the 27th of May 1967. And that was a referendum in Australia. And what's really important to understand is that in Australia, of course, it's compulsory voting. So everyone has to vote if you're over, 21 then, but 18 now. And the only way you can change the Australian Constitution is to hold a referendum, and the bar is very high. You have to win a majority of people in a majority of states.
Okay, so it's not like a strict percentage, but you have to win the majority of each state and then the majority of those.
No, a majority of people in a majority of states.
I see.
So, and the 67 referendum was very, very famous because referendum are incredibly hard to win in Australia. I think we've had 47 and only 8 have been successful.
Wow.
And it's never been successful unless there's been bipartisanship at the federal government level. But in 67, there was it had been preceded by a 10-year campaign of changing the Australian Constitution in 2 ways. And this will sound remarkable to you, but the first thing was to count Aboriginal people in the census. Prior to that, we were not counted.
So that would affect your representation in government, obviously. If you're not counted in the census, then you don't have your own representative. You don't have your own voice.
Well, there wasn't representatives,
right.
And I'll come to that. But the other thing that it did is it gave the Commonwealth the responsibility for Aboriginal affairs. Prior to that, each state and territory had different regimes, and they were all pretty dreadful, quite frankly. So that was a huge change for Australia. And it was the most successful referendum ever. It was like a 90-something% vote. Never been achieved before and never been achieved since, I can tell you. So I was 10 years old.
Yeah.
And up until the age of 10, I didn't count in Australia.
Wow.
I'm 68 next birthday, and it's kind of shocking when you realise how recent these things were, and there are still many people alive that were part of the 67 referendum campaign, and they're kind of heroes in Australia.
Yeah, I could understand that. I mean, this fight for civil rights, I think, ebbs and flows over time. And sometimes I think what governments try to do to address historic injustice can be inadequate to the task, right?
Sure. That's true, but there are moments of enormous national pride, and another moment of that was in February 2008 when Kevin Rudd, who's a good friend to the Asian Society, as I understand.
Yeah, he hired me.
He was the Prime Minister, and he just won government. And the first act as Prime Minister was to make an apology to the stolen generations in Australia. And the stolen generations for your audience, or for our audience, went on for a number of generations in Australia where Aboriginal children were removed from their Aboriginal families, basically to make them white, which of course didn't work, but it devastated families. Every family in Australia was touched by these policies, and it was forced removal, basically for being Aboriginal. And that had been a weeping sore in Australia for a very long time. Various states and territories had schemes to compensate and so forth, but there had been calls for 3 years for Prime Minister John Howard to say sorry. He refused to. And when Kevin Rudd won government, the first act was to apologise. And I can't describe to you what it was like. I was not in the Parliament then, but I was in the audience to watch the apology, and looking down onto the House of Representatives. Around the perimeter were members of the stolen generation. These were old people who, as little kids, were taken. And I will never forget that moment, because it was like Australia could actually breathe again.
Right.
There was a collective exhaling of the country, because finally a Prime Minister was saying sorry. And that also set off the 10 years of closing the gap as well.
Right.
But there were thousands of Aboriginal people in Parliament, outside Parliament, and the schools stopped and local governments stopped and put on huge screens so everyone could watch it. It was one of those moments.
It sounds absolutely incredible. I know from speaking to Kevin personally about this, it is one of the proudest moments of his career as well.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, and Tanya Plibersek, who's still in the cabinet, Tony Burke, and a number of people were actually members of Parliament then, and they all say it was their proudest moment. And I get quite emotional talking about this, because as I walked out of the Parliament, I ran into Auntie Mate Robinson, who was an elder. She's no longer with us, but she had a large black and white photograph of her mother, who had been taken and put into Cootamundra Girls' Home. And this gorgeous little Aboriginal girl with a big bow in her hair. I remember the photograph. And we just fell into each other's arms. And she said, "Linda, I brought Mummy with me today." And I'll never forget it.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like an absolutely beautiful moment where you can start to heal some of that generational trauma.
Yes. It meant so much to the country, but so much to those people who had been taken.
Right, right.
And I think I saw one of the most generous things I've ever seen in my life. After the Prime Minister finished making the apology, there was a response from the then Leader of the Opposition, and then the Leader of the Opposition and the Prime Minister and the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, whose name was Jenny Macklin, walked around speaking to the people around the perimeter. And there was also all surviving Prime Ministers bar one on the floor of the Parliament as well. And I remember one of the old ladies, they had a gift for the Prime Minister. and it was a glass coulamon, which is like it's a sort of a round-shaped oval.
Like a vessel of sorts.
Which we carried our babies in.
Oh.
And just for that old lady to stand up and present that, that's generosity.
That is true generosity and reciprocity. And again, it seems like a significant moment in the healing process for the nation to acknowledge its past and also to be gracious about that acknowledgement. So that I could understand how many people would see that as the highlight of their careers. I think, though, that, you talked a little bit about how that started a 10-year Closing the Gap. And there have been, kind of programs that have been developed in Australia that attempt to address some of the systemic injustices that have arisen from things like, the Stolen Generations policy. One of those programs was one that I think that you really took forward in a very positive direction. It is called the Community Development Program. I'd love to hear a little bit about what that program looked like when you came into office as Minister for Aboriginal Affairs and how you took that program and kind of made it work better for the community.
Well, when I became the minister, it was essentially what you would call a work for the dole program. So
you will have to explain that to our American audience.
So in Australia, there is a very strong social security system, and if you are unemployed, you get a payment, which is not time limited.
Right.
So the CDP, or the Community Development Program, was broken. Yeah, absolutely broken. You had it's in remote Australia.
Okay.
And when I say remote Australia, I mean remote Australia. Yeah. There are about 80,000 participants. Okay. And it was a trade-off for your social security payment.
I see. So you would give a certain number of hours of work to whatever the government assigned.
Yes.
And that would cover your social security payment.
What it had become is and there were providers of CDP which got an awful lot of money, and I don't know that all of them were very good. Right. Some of them were terrific, some of them were not. Right. But instead of the community deciding what the needed to happen, it was the providers that decided what the people would do, and some of it was just keeping busy. It wasn't things like helping to repair homes. It wasn't things like mowing the footy oval. It wasn't things like collecting the rubbish. It wasn't
sounds like not
parenting
community
programs.
Yeah.
So the community had lost and had no say over what they wanted.
I see.
And what was needed for that community.
Right.
So the other thing that had happened is that the mutual obligations. So now that's getting technical, but if you receive a social security payment, then you have to give back in some way by having a job plan or going to a certain number of job interviews, which were ridiculous. Okay. Because these are in remote communities, right?
Right. How many job interviews might be available? Maybe
none,
not much.
Not when you're hundreds of kilometres from a town. But it had just become an absolute broken system where, to the point where a lot of people didn't even register because there was no point to it. So I took on the role of turning it into a proper jobs program where people got holiday pay, where people got superannuation, where people got a minimum wage.
Right.
None of those things existed. So you could have been a CDP participant for 20 years and never accrue long service leave.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was broken.
Right.
So we turned it, or I led the charge in turning it into a program where people got proper conditions, proper wages, and the community decided on what people should do.
Have you been able to see some of the results of that? Have you seen community projects that you're particularly proud of?
Yeah. The interim thing I did was I freed up 25% of the money that went to job providers so they could do innovative things. I mean, if you're a senior elder in a community and you're mentoring young guys to keep them from committing suicide and teaching knowledge and tradition, how is that not a job?
Right. Essential community service.
Yeah, if you've been volunteering in an old person's facility and being a carer, how is that not a job?
Yeah.
So it was turning things on its head to say, well, you've got a local government area there. They've got no Aboriginal employees. How can you do that in a community where everyone's Aboriginal? So they would get a subsidy to employ people with the goal of keeping that person on permanently once the subsidy finished. That's the whole idea behind it. And I was able to also get 3,000 additional positions for the program. And so it's at the point now of rolling out and changing the world economically for remote communities.
That is a really incredible legacy to leave, and really speaks to, what government can do positively when the mindsets are open. And
you talk to local people and ask them what they want.
And then you listen and act on that knowledge. Sometimes the biggest barrier in government,
It
right?
is.
We talked a lot about representation and how important it is, important that Aboriginal people were counted in the census, maybe extra important that the entire country agreed to that with an overwhelming majority, because there's respect there when you know that everybody has buy-in for it. But there's also been a call for another referendum, a voice to Parliament. Tell us a little bit about the Voice to Parliament movement and the way that referendum developed in 2023.
Sure. It was probably one of the toughest parts of my life so far. So a call for constitutional recognition wasn't new in Australia.
Right.
It had gone back 10, 20 years.
So, literally reforming the Constitution to recognize that Australia sits on Aboriginal land and has been and Aboriginal people are an essential part of the sovereignty of Australia.
That's correct. There had been consultations right across the country, culminating in a very large meeting in Central Australia at Uluru, where there was remarkably a consensus about the way in which the Constitution needed to be reformed. And it was to be reformed by putting into the Constitution a thing that became known as the voice. So there would be an elected group of Aboriginal people who would constitute the voice, but that voice would be enshrined in the Constitution, because the experience had been that when representation is in legislation, then the next government could...
Legislation can change.
Yes, legislation can disappear, actually.
Yes.
There's
some experience with that here as well.
Yeah, I bet you do. So the idea of putting this body into the Constitution was the way in which First Peoples would be recognised. And there have been calls, as I said, for decades for such a thing, for constitutional recognition. I won't go into all the details, but there was a very organised process of having a reference group, which I worked with, having an engagement group, which I worked with, but there was also a separate or two separate big Aboriginal groups or organisations that actually ran the campaign. So it wasn't just a government exercise, it was a community exercise. The really disappointing thing, remembering I said that there'd never been a successful referendum without bipartisan support, is that the opposition, through the National Party and the Liberal Party, walked away from bipartisan support very early.
I see.
So that made it incredibly hard. But I led my party's campaign for constitutional recognition, and it had been a very, very strong commitment from the Prime Minister in the lead up to us winning government. But the outcome was devastating.
Yeah.
It was not supported. The only jurisdiction that carried it was the ACT, the Australian Capital Territory, and it lost in every other state.
Wow.
Yeah. So the level of misinformation, disinformation, and quite honestly, the level of racism and abuse that came not just my way, but to all of the people campaigning was unbelievable.
Yeah.
I got to the point where I didn't even look at my social media.
Sure.
My staff did, so they saw it all, but I just took the view that I am going to take a page out of Michelle Obama's book.
Smart.
Well, what is it? They go low, we go high.
That's right.
So it was very difficult, and the attacks on me in the Parliament were question time after question time after question time. Every question to me, will the Voice decide defence policy?
Oh, my.
Will the Voice decide anything about anything? I mean, it was just ridiculous things. Will the Voice determine the Reserve Bank policy? I mean, just scaremongering like you wouldn't believe.
Right.
But you know what? Even though the referendum was lost, you take the silver linings, and I have. Yeah. So the three silver linings that I've really taken from what was a devastating defeat is, four really. There is still a strong call for constitutional recognition. That will never go away.
Right.
Until it happens. But the other three things is that in communities where there are large Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations, the vote was really high, 80, 90% yes.
Great.
So our people wanted it.
Yeah.
The second thing is that there is a new generation of young Aboriginal leaders who are magnificent, and they have realised that, you know, things are political.
Right.
That they are inheriting the work that we've done for so many decades. And the other thing is 6.5 million Australians said yes.
Right.
So they are not small things.
Yes.
And whilst the overall outcome was a defeat, I take great inspiration from those things.
Absolutely. I think especially the generational turnover of these issues should be a source of inspiration and pride for you and for everybody who's worked before you. That's really, what is the Martin Luther King Jr. quote? The arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. Seeing successive generations kind of find their place in that story.
Well, I relate very much to that saying, and I've actually used it quite a bit in the last few months. Saying change is hard.
Yeah.
And it's never linear.
Right.
And sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Right.
But the arc of justice bends towards...
Yeah, the arc of time bends towards justice. Yes, absolutely. I know that obviously representation is very important, and it creates the conditions under which government can have that good exchange, the listening process. But of course, there are lots of things that are going on outside of representation and constitutional reform that are also trying to address what is an incredibly socioeconomically complex set of issues. And noting that even as of last year, there were a lot of socioeconomic outcomes outlined by Australia's National Agreement on Closing the Gap that were not listed as, quote, on track. So only 4 of 19 were listed as on track. How do you feel a little about the progress of the Closing the Gap initiative, and how do you think that's changed, over the last few years?
Sure. Well, that has been my responsibility for the last few years. And the one of the targets that is on track is baby birth weights.
Okay.
Now that's really important because
tell us more.
Because imagine what needs to happen to have babies born at a healthy birth weight.
Yeah, you need a full prenatal care.
Yeah, and you need nutrition. You need housing. But the ones that are really disturbing is the number of Aboriginal children being removed from their families through child protection.
I see.
That is just growing exponentially.
Yeah.
And also incarceration rates, which is devastating as well. In Australia, the federal government is responsible for some things, but state and territory governments are responsible for things like health, education, child protection, the judicial system.
Sure.
So it's very complex. It's about making sure that you're working closely with your state and territory colleagues, and I was responsible for that, and we met about 4 times a year. So state and territories have responsibility also for closing the gap, as well as the targets, as well as the federal government. And then there is an organisation called the Coalition of Peace, which is an Aboriginal organisation made up of Aboriginal bodies from around the country that you work with in terms of closing the gap. So it is a huge network of things. But I think the most important point to make here is that the socioeconomic situation for Aboriginal people in Australia is shocking.
Yeah.
it's, I was in a community a few months ago, and there was a 2-bedroom townhouse. It had 30 people living in it.
Wow.
And 20 people per household is not unusual.
Yeah.
In particularly remote Australia.
Is there is it unavailability of housing is one of the issues?
It's a number of things. It's about investment.
Right.
And one of the things I'm very proud of, before I retired, I was able to secure $400 million for the Northern Territory for housing, which has got the worst housing in the country.
Right.
But it's just think about it. If you've got 20 people in a 3-bedroom home, it's probably not safe.
Right.
There is very little food.
Sure.
There is probably very difficult conditions.
Right.
And what suffers is people's health.
Yeah.
What suffers is outcomes for children.
Right.
Which explains why life expectancy is so different in Australia. But unless you've got decent housing, then you can't expect all of those other things to flow.
Right.
Including employment, and it just becomes this vicious cycle. And in remote communities, which are almost 100% Aboriginal people, there is food insecurity.
Right.
There are community stores which, $11 for a lettuce.
Because of how far it has to be carried to get there.
That's
it's
right.
such an
and
import.
The same thing with housing. If you're building a house in a remote community,
Right.
it's expensive.
Right. You've got to haul everything you need.
And
to that
sometimes
community.
it's on barges.
Right.
It's not always by road. And in a lot of those places you can only get in during the dry season.
Okay.
So it becomes very, very, and it's expensive.
Right.
So the way in which I was able to achieve the financial, the $400 million for housing is to then transfer that to the Northern Territory government, who then had the responsibility of delivering the program. But it's not simple. And, things like rheumatic heart disease, which is a disease of the 50s and the 40s,
Right.
is still very prevalent amongst Aboriginal communities. The biggest issue is diabetes, and that goes to lifestyle and diet,
Right.
and cardiovascular disease, which has, they're all preventable diseases, but they are so prevalent in the Aboriginal community, it's kind of hard to explain.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it does seem as though, although a lot of progress has been made, there's still areas of improvement. And as you kind of, are reflecting on your career as you're leaving politics, what are some of the moments of pride for you, and where do you think the work needs to be prioritized now?
Well, there is still, of course, the question of where things will go in terms of constitutional reform. But for me, I think the most important thing is a national process of truth-telling.
Okay.
So what I mean by that is that there are still a lot of Australians that don't know the whole history of the country.
Right.
Certainly don't understand the grinding poverty that many First Peoples experience. And there has been a lot of good truth-telling in school curriculum, for example. But to me, a community-led truth-telling process in Australia would be amazing. You see pockets of it.
Sure.
I'll give you one example. There's a interpretive track and a monument at a place called Mile Creek, which is in northwestern New South Wales. And that was a famous massacre site. And for the first time, those that did the massacring were brought to justice. I can't remember what year it was, but it was in the early 1800s. And it happened, the actual massacre site is on private property, but through the local government there, those that did the relatives of those that did the massacring and relatives of those that were massacred came together in this incredible healing process, created this amazing monument and this walking track, and their ultimate goal is to have an interpretive centre as well. But that is a real example of truth-telling, where people have come together and come to terms with a pretty horrible event. Both horrible events happened all over the country.
Sure.
And, truth-telling is not about blame. It's not about guilt. It is about growing up.
Right.
And I think that's where Australia's at.
That's an amazing sentiment to think about, bringing some of these stories to light in terms of, sitting with uncomfortable feelings and being mature and adult about it.
Yeah.
It's good to hear that Australia is reaching that process. I feel like there are many communities throughout the world that could use some help in that regard, including here in our own. I did want to talk to you a little bit about climate. We know that Aboriginal populations are disproportionately exposed to climate extremes, and these have been worsening. How is the Australian government kind of managing or adapting their efforts, their reconciliation efforts, to account for this kind of disproportionate exposure to extreme weather events?
Sure. And I'm very proud of this. And I hope that I had some influence on it. The Minister for Climate Change, the Minister for the Environment, and the Minister for the Environment have both established Aboriginal consultative groups who are very involved in directing the efforts of the government in relation to issues that affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in those policy areas, and have direct access to the minister. So that's just two examples. Let me give you of how the voices of Aboriginal people, despite the referendum loss, but the voices of Aboriginal people are critical to the policy positions that Cabinet takes and caucus and then by way of the government takes. But the other real life example is in the Torres Strait, which is in between the top of Australia and Papua New Guinea. The Torres Strait Islands are there, and they are part of Australia. They are islands, and climate change is absolutely being felt there. Yeah. Part of the burial practices is that you buried your ancestors quite close to the water, and because of sea level rise, the bones are being washed away. Wow. Which is incredibly distressing. And the issue is that the Torres Strait Islander communities have a responsibility culturally to stay with their ancestors.
Of course.
and they're just being washed away. So
So they feel like they're failing their responsibility.
that's right. Yeah. So part of what I was doing when and will be taken forward by the person that's replaced me in the ministry is assisting the Torres Strait Regional Authority in building seawalls. That's just one example.
Right. And I think it's an excellent example because it's an example of how culture is affected by these weather changes. You said something earlier that I want to go back to, actually, as I'm thinking about climate change and how it affects the Australia and the Pacific Island region. You said when it came to the Uluru Statement from the Heart, it was amazing that all of the groups came together and formed this statement. And I'm wondering if you could just give us a very general sense of, we've really talked about Aboriginal communities as if they're kind of a monolith, right? Like it's one set of people. And in fact, as we all know, this is, still a system with many different cultures embedded in it, and maybe one that has some sort of affinity or affiliation or connection to Pacific Island culture, generally speaking. I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about, how the Aboriginal community works together and how those cultural differences within the own Aboriginal community complicates or otherwise affects some of the problem set that we're looking at.
That is such a good point. The diversity amongst Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is enormous. Hundreds of different languages, different practices, and the thing that I'm sure much of our audience will understand is First Nations people connection to country.
Right.
So, I remember as a little school kid being taught that we were nomadic and just wandered around everywhere. Of course, that's not true. Very defined nation boundaries. I'm of the Wiradjuri Nation, which is in southwestern New South Wales. And I cannot speak on behalf of anyone else except Wiradjuri.
Right.
I can't speak on behalf of Tharawal. I can't speak on behalf of Nyampa. I can't speak on behalf of Gamilaroi. I can only speak on behalf of Wiradjuri. And the important thing to understand is that whilst there is no pan-Aboriginal Australia,
affinity or
Australia.
Australia.
There isn't. I'll give you an example. One of the practices in Australia, which I'm starting to see a little bit in the US as well, is we do acknowledgement and welcome to country at school assemblies, the opening of Parliament every day. And the only place I can do a welcome to country is in Wiradjuri country.
Right, because welcome to country is really about the First Nations people
from that land.
From that land, welcoming outsiders in.
Yes, that's right. But I can do an acknowledgement of country anywhere because you're acknowledging the traditional owners. Does that explain it to you?
Yeah, so an acknowledgement of country would be, for example, at the beginning of this podcast, we would have said, we're so happy to be here. On Lenape territory in the northeastern United States.
That's correct.
Something like that.
Yeah.
And it's another sign of respect, perhaps.
It is, and it's something that is very much part of Australia, even on television when you have the news, they say we're broadcasting from Ngunnawal country or Ngambri country. And it's really become very much part of Australian culture.
Is it well received by the Aboriginal communities? Does that feel respectful and acknowledging?
Yes, it is very well received.
Yeah.
In fact, it's noted if it doesn't happen.
Oh, I'm sure. You have had an amazing career. We'll we've found that Prime Minister Albanese described your career as full of firsts. First Aboriginal Member of Parliament?
In New South Wales.
In New South Wales. First Aboriginal Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, correct?
No, first Aboriginal woman elected to the House of Representatives.
Thank you.
And first Aboriginal woman to be a member of Cabinet.
To be a member of Cabinet, yes, amazing. What advice can you give leaders, future leaders who are female, perhaps who come from disadvantaged communities, who are also kind of charting their own careers? Like, what did you learn, or what would you pass on to people who want to follow the groundbreaking path that you've followed?
Wow. I think that even some of the most difficult moments of your life will teach you something. And I remember when my husband died, which is 16 years ago now, I spent 3 months in a fog.
Yes.
And I remember standing at my window in the kitchen and just getting washed with compassion. So it made me a much more compassionate person.
Yeah. Because you could find some compassion for yourself. And then that.
No, mostly other people.
Okay.
And the other bit of advice is, sit with yourself. Yeah. Everyone's remarkable. Everyone is made up of hundreds of stories, and understand what they are and how you've been made. You don't have to change the world overnight. Just have to make it a little bit better than you found it. And I would say, particularly to women, lean on each other.
Yeah. Find community amongst each other.
Yes.
Yeah.
And never give up.
And never give up. Oh, that's the most important one. So you have had, again, this amazing career. You've accomplished so much in government, and yet you tell me you're 68. What lies ahead for you? What's next?
Well, I'm not quite sure, but I think it'll be fantastic. I've been talking to a university in Australia about what they would like me to do. Mm-hmm. I'm sure there'll be a number of boards that would be interested in what I can offer. And my immediate job is to make sure that the next member of Barton is from the Labor Party.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we look forward to seeing your success on that, and to staying in touch on this conversation. And thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.